program has been made possible by viewers like you.
In December 1989, the world watched as Romanians overthrew their hated dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu. In the months that followed his downfall, we were shocked by the tragic images that emerged as the legacy of his dictatorship. Only now is the truth behind these terrible events beginning to come out. Veteran Newsweek correspondent Edward Baer returns to Romania in search of the man who created this reign of terror. Baer follows the career of a stuttering cobbler's apprentice who became a feared tyrant at home, while the West saw him as its favorite communist. This is the real story of the rise and fall of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu, a tale of love, megalomania, corruption, and ultimately horror.
celor 5 țări socialiste în Ceoslovacia constituie o mare greșeală.
As a correspondent in 1968, I had witnessed Ceausescu's extraordinary popularity after his defiance of the Soviet Union had made him a hero to his people and to the West. A year after his death, I drove 100 miles from Bucharest to his hometown. I wanted to find out why things had gone so terribly wrong.
Cu emoția și mândria întregii țări,
with the emotion and pride of the whole nation, we see images of the old Romanian homestead at Scornicești, where Nicolae, son of Alexandrina and Andruță, was born in 1918. The man who was to become the great head of the Romanian Communist Party and of the country, and who is today the incarnation of the highest aspirations of the Romanian people.
This rebuilt peasant cottage bore little relation to the real thing. The story starts here at Nicolae Ceausescu's birthplace in Scornicești.
All the reverential biographies of the Ceausescu era portray him in almost caricatural terms as a precocious genius determined from childhood to root out social injustice. From contemporaries, former colleagues and prison companions speaking freely for the first time, I was to get a very different picture at almost every stage of his life.
This was the kind of house young Nicolae really lived in. It still belongs to his neighbor, Floria Ceausescu. He was at school with his more famous cousin, Nicolae.
He spent most of the time on his own and hardly ever played with any of the other children. At school, he was not very good and he did not get much of an education anyway. He was rather a secretive, shrewd boy with a hidden soul.
Unable to vent their pent-up rage on Ceausescu himself at the time of his death, a hometown mob marched on the cemetery, desecrating the tomb of his father Andruța. This erstwhile saintly patriarch, father of 13 children, Nicolae was the third, was now revealed to have been the village drunk, his wife the saintly victim of his violent outbursts. He called 2 of his sons Nicolae because at the time of their birth, he'd been too intoxicated to think of another name. It was partly to escape a drunken father that young Nicolae Ceausescu, aged 12, left his village for Bucharest in 1930. Bucharest of the 1930s was one of Europe's most cosmopolitan capitals, the Paris of the Balkans. But young Ceausescu had neither the background, nor the education, nor the financial means to enjoy any of its delights. This spectacle was to fuel nothing but alienation, resentment, and rage. Romania's politics were held in low esteem by everyone. King Carol was unpopular, extravagant, and highly eccentric. The king first encouraged, then attempted to repress the fascist Iron Guards, who briefly fascinated young Ceausescu. He lived with a sister, Nicolina, and became a cobbler's apprentice, though he was lazy and never learnt to make shoes. From fellow apprentices, he acquired a crude fervor for socialism. Asked by his employer how on earth he expected to make a living if he didn't learn a trade, Nicolae Ceausescu said, "I'll become Romania's Stalin."
After leaving his village, the process of hard, arduous learning continues. But his thirst for knowledge is now combined with a thirst for social justice. The young worker would spend hours in hot pursuit of the dialectics of the class struggle, of scientific socialism, and in studying communist philosophy.
I uncovered one of the many Ceausescu myths in the now closed museum of the Romanian Communist Party. Ion Argelianu, its director, had been one of the myth makers. He had kept a secret file on the real Ceausescu and had a document which showed that Ceausescu's first brush with the police at the age of 15 had been for street brawling. Later, the incident was turned into a political confrontation. A year later, Vasile Dumitrescu recruited him into the tiny underground Communist Party.
When I first met Nicolae Ceausescu, he was dressed as a poor peasant boy with socks pulled over his torn, worn-out trousers and wearing an old pair of boots twice his size. He held in his lap, awkwardly, a customer's shoe he was trying to mend with a needle and thread. He stuttered badly and pulled faces when he spoke. I felt sorry for him and said to myself he would make a perfect recruit for the Communist Party.
In 1936, aged 18, young Nicolae was arrested after distributing communist pamphlets and taken to Brasov, Transylvania, for a mass trial before a military court. Ceausescu craved to be the center of attention. His behavior at the Brasov trial was an early hint that this small-time agitator possessed an iron will to claw his way to the top. George Matescu, a journalist who covered the trial, expected him to be acquitted.
Ceausescu's rudeness and impertinence throughout the trial focused the attention of the court on him as an agitator and led the judges to hand out heavy sentences, not only to him, but to the others on trial as well. Ceausescu didn't seem to care about his comrades. I think all he wanted was to be the center of attention.
He was sentenced to 3 years in Doftana jail. The myth-makers would later turn this prison into a place of pilgrimage for Ceausescu, and a visit there would become a compulsory part of the Romanian school curriculum. The myth was that in jail, Ceausescu's leadership qualities turned him into a legendary figure. In fact, he was a mere protege of senior communists who undertook his education. He acquired a smattering of Marxist-Leninist dogma from old books still on the prison library shelves today. He memorized texts his fellow prisoners said he did not fully understand. Here, he met the leaders of the Communist Party for the first time. One of them was the trade unionist George Apostol.
Every night, at locking up time, when the guards checked the cells, they would beat up some of the comrades. We'd all shout, "Who's being beaten up?" Ceausescu always shouted that he was being beaten up. But then, when we went out into the exercise yard, we saw no marks or bruises on him. So later on, we realized it was just his way of trying to impress the party leaders.
On his release in 1939, he became a communist youth leader. The party was now his real family. At a social gathering of young communists, he met Elena Petrescu. She would play an increasingly important role in his life and eventually become part of the same myth. Later, propagandists superimposed both their pictures on this photograph of a communist-organized May Day parade they never actually attended. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland and the Second World War began. Romanian oil was vital to Germany's war effort. Romania's dictator, Marshal Antonescu, became Hitler's ally. Ceausescu, described on the police list as a shoemaker, was one of Romania's 800 known communists to be arrested. So was Pavel Campianu. They would share the same cell for 2 years.
Ceausescu had many small but relevant manifestations of hysteria. He very fast used to lose control. When he disagreed with somebody, his way of disagreeing was at the verge of an explosion. He was violent in his way of speaking, totally undelicate. Even he was trembling when he was contradicted. But he had natural intelligence. He was very courageous. He was very devoted to the cause.
In 1943, Ceausescu was transferred to Târgu Jiu prison. There, he met Gheorghe Gorgiu-Dej, the highest-ranking Romanian communist in captivity. Ceausescu made himself indispensable to him in all sorts of ways. A fellow inmate, Eugen Rusu, witnessed it all.
Ceausescu was very young, completely insignificant. He used to stutter terribly, but he knew how to look after himself. He wormed his way into the company of Gheorghiu-Dej, the Communist Party leader. Dej had a personal servant who brought him his meals, cleaned his shoes, looked after his clothes. And the name of this servant was Nicolae Ceausescu.
Advancing Russian troops entered Bucharest after an anti-German coup staged by King Michael, Carol's son, on August 23, 1944. Watching the Russian army's victory parade in Bucharest, Ceausescu, now free, must have known his whole life was about to change. For even before Yalta, Churchill and Roosevelt had agreed to Romania becoming a Soviet-dominated puppet state while insisting on free elections. Ceausescu was on the road to real power at last. He ran for office in the 1946 elections, which the communists, thanks to stuffed ballot boxes, won by a landslide. Minutes after this appearance in the town of Slatina, an event occurred that should have put an immediate end to his political ambitions. A local bank manager had refused to contribute to Communist Party funds. On election day, in a fit of rage, Ceausescu murdered him on the steps of the town hall. The cover-up lasted until after Ceausescu's own death. The crime has never been revealed before. Dej, now Romania's leader, was aware of this murder. But impressed by Ceausescu's hard work and dedication, he made him, at 30, an instant Major General. His colleagues all said he was rough with subordinates, but cringing to superiors. Ceausescu now lived the life of the privileged communist elite. He'd married Elena in 46, quickly fathering 3 children, Valentin, Zoya, and Nicu. Colleagues noted Elena invariably ruled the roost at home, was invaluable to him as he rose up the party ranks, and helped him control his stammer. In the early 60s, Dej started moving Romania out of the Russian orbit, becoming popular in the country for the first time. But in 1965, Dej learned he was dying of cancer. Ceausescu felt such an opportunity should not be missed.
The infighting that took place inside the palaces of top Romanian Communist Party leaders was usually a closely guarded secret. But 2 leading contenders told me how, as Georgiu Dej lay dying behind these walls, Nicolae Ceausescu outmaneuvered them, even though he was not the front runner to succeed him.
In this secluded lakeside mansion, in the final weeks of his life, Dej made a dramatic decision which might well have changed the course of Romanian history. He decided to ditch the overeager Ceausescu. George Apostol, the chief contender, claimed that in the last few weeks of Dej's life, he became the heir apparent.
Ceausescu's impulsive and unpredictable character was causing Dej more and more concern. 3 months before his death, he intended to call a general meeting of the party to have Ceausescu removed from his post as head of the party administration and to give me his job. But Dej died before this meeting took place.
Ordinary Romanians only learned of Dej's illness the day before he died. As the preparations for the funeral were made, Apostol could not know that Ceausescu had prepared a master plan to grab the leadership himself. Inside the Central Committee building, he got a key group of party elders to back him, promising they would remain the real power behind the scenes. They mistakenly believed they could handle the inexperienced Ceausescu. 25 years later, Maura, Ceausescu's chief ally, was still trying to justify himself.
I felt Ceausescu was young, a hard worker, willing to learn and open to new ideas. Also, he came from a peasant family, a first-rate background, so I thought he'd make an excellent party secretary. It was only much later I realized my mistake. If I had known then what I came to know later, I would not only have opposed him, I would have attempted to have him removed.
Adio, scump tovarăș și prieteni. Vom păstra în inimile noastre nestinsă amintirea vieții sale luminoase.
The loyal servant had stepped into his master's shoes. Shortly afterwards, he destroyed Dej's reputation, turning him into a non-person. He would steal Dej's liberal policies to become popular and claim them as his own. A masterstroke 3 years later was a visit to Prague in August 1968. Alexander Dubček, the reform-minded Czech leader, was trying to introduce communism with a human face. The West believed Ceausescu was equally keen on reform, and Ceausescu did his best to sustain this belief. Only 5 days after his visit, the Soviets and its allies invaded Czechoslovakia. Romania was the only Warsaw Pact country that refused to join in the operation. Ceausescu now played his trump card.
Răspunderea trupelor celor 5 țări socialiste în Ceoslovacia constituie o mare greșeală, o primejdie gravă pentru pacea în Europa, pentru soarta socialismului în lume.
In Bucharest, even anti-communist Romanians talked to me in glowing terms about Ceausescu that month. Overnight, as far as Western leaders were concerned, he became the man to watch. Richard Nixon was one of those responsible for creating the myth of Ceausescu, the anti-Russian communist, who should be rewarded for his independent stand. But few realized Moscow's reaction never went beyond mild exasperation.
Mr. President, just a year ago, you welcomed me to Bucharest as the first American president ever to visit Romania. And today, I'm very honored to welcome you to Washington, D.C. as the first president of Romania ever to visit the United States of America.
In Disneyland, Nicolae Ceausescu should have realized that his new image had an improbable Mickey Mouse quality. But Ceausescu had started believing in his own myth. His budding megalomania was the start of Romania's enduring nightmare. The turning point came in 1971 with his trip to China. He reveled in the welcome. Unaware of the appalling consequences of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, he saw only what he was meant to see, a disciplined people dedicated to the worship of the now senile Mao Zedong. He felt China's Cultural Revolution was a model for Romania to follow. By now, Elena Ceausescu was eager to play a more important role at her husband's side. Chiang Ching, Mao's wife, lost no time convincing Elena she should become more of a power in her own right. From China, the Ceausescus flew to North Korea. The personality cult of its leader, Kim Il-sung, was on an even more grandiose scale. The Ceausescus were suitably impressed. 3 years later, in 1974, showing signs of growing egomania, Ceausescu made himself president. He told one of his ministers, "A man like me comes along only once every 500 years. Despite his rift with Moscow, he remained a Stalinist in economic matters. On paper, Romanian economic growth was staggering, and he had no trouble raising money from Western banks. But Romania's social and medical problems were totally neglected, and most of the prestige investments he ordered were costly, uneconomic, and environmentally catastrophic. Elena took the advice of Chiang Ching, Mao's wife, seriously. Her lightning promotion within the Communist Party went hand in hand with a new identity.
We are fortunate to be under the direct leadership of Comrade Elena Ceausescu, Doctor of Engineering, academic, President of the National Council for Science and Education, scholar of international renown and reputation. She is a glittering ornament to Romanian science throughout the world.
In Petrești, her native village, they knew all about Elena. Her father had run a rural goods store in this tiny house. But she was so powerful, the local inhabitants were too frightened to set the record straight. Her school records remained hidden under floorboards for several decades. When the local mayor finally dug them out, they revealed she had flunked everything but singing, sewing, and gymnastics in her 4th year, and had dropped out altogether at the age of 14. She was a repetenta, meaning someone too mediocre to move to the next grade. Instead, in the 30s, she moved to Bucharest. Her first job was as an unskilled worker in a hole-in-the-wall pharmaceuticals factory. Over 30 years later, becoming head of the Institute for Chemical Research, despite a total lack of real academic credentials, was the best revenge.
Fie că este vorba de lucrări tehnologice.
It was an order that all the work at this institute had to bear the name of Elena Ceausescu as the principal author and inventor. When the research papers were submitted to her for signature, she didn't even bother to look at them, as she was incapable of understanding their content. How could she? She didn't even know the formulas for water or carbon dioxide.
For years, foreign scientists were fooled by an elaborate masquerade.
I was told that Mrs. Ceausescu liked, I shouldn't even say Mrs. Ceausescu, that Comrade Ceausescu liked very much to consult everybody in her team about the answers, that the answers were supposed to be collective, not individual. So whenever somebody in our meetings, a foreign delegate, would ask a question, I was supposed to first wait for Mrs. Ceausescu to say the answer, and then somebody else in her entourage would say a different answer. Mrs. Ceausescu would sometimes repeat what that person said. Then I was allowed to translate. But actually, it was translating from the other person, not from Mrs. Ceausescu directly. She had some papers in front of her. She sometimes consulted the papers, but her answer, I was told, I was never allowed to translate.
The personality cult pageantry staged for the Ceausescus had begun with somewhat amateurish parodies of the Chinese and North Korean models. But party choreographers with limitless resources orchestrated these extravaganzas, giving them an almost religious flavor, identifying Romania with one godlike personality. Romanian artists outdid each other in commemorating the virtues of the perpetually youthful-looking couple and their mutual love affair with the Romanian people. School children were taught to worship the Danube of thought, the treasure of wisdom and charisma. Ceausescu became a national hero, on a par with medieval kings and past Romanian nation builders like Vlad the Impaler. His collected works of stupefying dullness and actually ghosted by others were in every home and schoolroom. At every level of society, there was this servile homage. It was all part of Romania's instinctive deference to authority, a traditional feature of its past. Everything about Ceausescu's public image was fabricated, including his television appearances. This film editor's sole task for over 20 years was to remove all his glitzes.
All his speeches required hours of work involving an enormous amount of editing. I had to cut out the long pauses, the stuttering, the many grammatical errors, the facial contortions. There were specific protocol rules. Nobody taller than him could be shown in the same picture. If his VIP guests, politicians or foreign dignitaries, were taller, the group would only be shown sitting down. The rule was the cameraman assigned had to be smaller than he was. Elena was just as much of a problem. She could not be photographed or filmed next to a woman. Only in the company of men, where she had no rival. Also, we were told never to show her in profile.